Yeah, she likes it already.
Well, how much you think? Anything that I want. The guy was really asshole. Because, well, see, there was one guy that handled everything. Someone of them was out. He said, you that guy on the American time of every way. Back in 69. He says, and he had no problem. You know, railroads have a watch out. Going to the libraries, big watch out. They had a stage, used my article for staging, a whole bunch of guys. And I wasn't open yet, I was still repairing it. Yeah, you know, and when it comes the other way, it's like, so I let them do it as a courtesy, but then I put the budget here. Hey, you know this guy? Oh, George, yeah, he's paying. I said, you gotta put a big word in for me, because I need to get this done too. Okay, we call it. And a couple months later, we called him, and he says, for $1,000. You'll pay like 5 years up front or 10 years up front. And all that is so and then I had to have a stop order. Each guy had to have a stop order. So you have somebody who was off the railroad, sit here, ended up hot. And it was nice that I made up. A shop, khakis, and I just got it over. And I see it. Oh yeah! Long time no see. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So Brad is part of the wine making restoration. Yeah, it's good. Great, great.
Scary sometimes. You're covered everything.
I'm kidding.
But I just don't want to say that. No, but I don't know.
Not teaching on modifying here.
But you said, she is a,
Make the space, it's like that. A lot of volunteers get trains from Montreal to Boston, stop there now. It's like this I don't know if that's an either or what do they have on the western part of the hamstring? Not kids around.
Help people.
So I had somebody that came to Claremont, I told the story to Charlotte. He used to work in Claremont, and I knew him way back, but he was retired, disabled, came down to see some friends. Went out to trade, I don't fall. It was on a weekend. He's got a luggage, he's walking on Maple Ave, trying to get to a phone or something. And so he had a heart attack. He wound up in Valley Regional, they put a stent in him, and now he's trying to get back home. And he stopped in, he led me some beer, I got wiped out, And I said, what that really says? He said, I'm going to call a cab or somebody, what happened? So, and there's more than once I've had people, very religious Jewish people, Sabbath, I remember praying with my they had a set overnight. Because we're praying, what are you going to do? Except they came back and stayed. They said this would be a revenue or all going to have keys, throw them stay there for the night, weather started. So they take it's like, what do you do? Walk us down. Yeah, right.
The layout of the room says I gotta stand way down here. But I'm not so sure about that. We got
Anyway, so I got a Hyundai today.
I'd like to think I've always been a mover and shaker. So I'm keeping that up here.
Mike on?
I don't know.
No, what we did say is.
Who's in charge of the microphone?
Big John does a little steel on me off the back.
People running to begin.
Yeah, okay,
So-
turning on your mic.
Is that the deal? Am I turned on or what?
You'll have to tell us.
We'll find out. Not my dancing time. Folks, please do come and join us. Take a load up here. Grab some cookies on your way, sandwiches. Aurora Bakery has done a good turn in feeding us tonight. Sure, come to the cheap seats. I so welcome all of you I told people when I began to plan this, I don't know whether we're going to have 10 people or 100. So each of you can count as 10 people if you like, and we'll take your money at the door. So excuse me. As I thought about how best to pay tribute to Brad, I thought about this space here, and it took me a while to sort that all out in my own head, and then to wrestle permission, which wasn't hard, from the school board. They were very supportive, and one of them commented that Brad Sears was the best teacher he had here in Newport. And so I know he was my best teacher. We'd been together 30 years. I'd like to think I taught him a few things, but that's okay. He was the spirit behind whatever wild, whimsical thought I had about how to do write and take pictures and actually sell some of that. So whenever, when we moved here, it wasn't long before people in Newport were saying, hey, we got to have a new newspaper. The newspaper we have isn't doing the job. We need a newspaper. And I said, pick me. I know how to do that. And I had indeed been trained by community journalist in Massachusetts. I'd been editor of a newspaper there. And those community papers were beginning their trail out of relevancy, unfortunately, as the corporate world began to realize that some people actually read those newspapers. And they started to try to homogenize them. And I wasn't much interested in that, but I did have a wonderful, wonderful learning curve with other like-minded community people in the community of Foxborough, and then in the community of Mansfield next door. And then up here, it seemed like the perfect flex time job, because we moved up here because my parents had entered their slippery slope, and they lived in Grantham. And I very much did not want to insult them by moving in to their garage apartment. I did not want them to think that I did not have good reason to be living nearby. And so I set out. I got to know Newport pretty well, and Brad was out finding whatever job he could that meant screwdrivers and wrenches and decision making, and he did that very quickly and easily wherever we were. He was always working. When I first met him, I was in my 40s, he was in his 50s, his early 50s, and I'd hear about this job or this location or that location. And finally I said, Brad, did you work these jobs for like a few weeks at a time, one after the other? Or did you work these jobs all at once? He said, oh, all at once. He would work about 3 jobs at a time. He would work doing mechanical work, hi Cindy, and he would work as a consultant to garages all over Massachusetts and into New Hampshire, teaching them how to make a little more money, and do it with professional integrity. That was the theory anyway. And he was on the cusp of helping helping experienced, accomplished garage owners to understand what it meant that cars now had computers. And he would always be ahead of that curve and bring that, develop a workshop and bring other established garage owners to a level of confidence where they could understand how they needed to go forward in serving their clientele, because they were losing business to those dealers who often didn't know what they needed to know either, he found. So, excuse me. I found, oh, thank you very much. He used to work in food services. I don't know why he doesn't anymore, but thank you, Steve. So when I met Brad, I was in between jobs myself, and I was wanting to know what his work was. Was he just a big liar telling me all these jobs he always had? What was his work? So we'd get in the car, we'd go out to a friend's garage, and the friend and I would talk about how we needed to write a mystery book, because if an old lady in Maine could do a mystery series, we could too. And in the meantime, Brad would be taking his equipment around to one car, another car. He'd see 6 or 8 cars. He'd put his instrument on 6 or 8 cars, one after the other, and then he'd go to his friend and he'd tell him what he needed to do with each car, and Billy said okay, and then Billy would hand Brad a bunch of $100 bills, and we'd go on to the next place, which might have been a movie or dinner. It was fine with me. But he liked having me along because I was the first woman potential partner in his life who took an interest in what his work was, and how he did it, and why he did it, and how it was changing. Meanwhile, we'd be driving along 128, and he'd pick up his car phone. My ex-husband called him a big shot with a car phone. Picked up his car phone and would be on the phone with the people who had the traffic helicopter business, and would tell them that where there was a breakdown or an accident that I hadn't seen, but he saw driving along. In my years with Brad, he was the most incredible driver in most any situation that I have ever ridden with. And I can't tell you I learned much about driving from him, but I didn't have any accidents, I know that. But his eyes were everywhere. On the highway, or at a garage, or sitting at a town meeting, his eyes were everywhere. He was thirsty for action. He was thirsty for problem solving. And I appreciated that. And then he became part of my growing family, some of which have successfully grown so far. I would like you all to know my daughter Andrea, her daughter Huda, her daughter Sumaya, and this guy back here, Ibrahim. They are visiting me this week, and I'm enjoying putting them to work, helping me with this memorial service. My other children, I know their thoughts are with us. For some reason, they say they're busy. So one is an incredible organic farmer, and the other is an incredible, I'm not sure, but she's in Seattle, and she runs a foundation, and she flies around and runs seminars and gives speeches and so forth. And I'm sure it's very talented, all of which she, no doubt, got somewhere. So they have they've been part of Brad's life also for 30 years. They were in school, and when he came to join us, and he was wonderful with them. And so I always appreciated that. I appreciated watching Brad's professional interest change. We came to Newport together because I wanted to leave suburbia and come up here to be near my parents. And so that's what we did, and that's where both of us have lived longer than a lot of other places. And so you're stuck with us. We started a little newspaper called the Wicked Good Calendar because we're both writers, and it was like putting on comfortable shoes. And we loved to be able to kick ass with one of the newspapers, and we loved to put information out on the highways with the other newspaper that would bring people to our small businesses who were advertising. So that was a good run. And then Brad got this job with the schools. What's he doing? He got a job with the schools. That meant I couldn't send him to meetings. I couldn't send him out as a reporter to cover. What a bummer. But how wonderful it was for his students. I don't think they could have been so lucky to have someone who was an encyclopedia of automobiles and automobile history and technology and inventive himself, and liking to tell a good story. Not about himself often. He was not a braggart that I'm aware of, unless he was talking about me. But he was not a braggart. He would filter in some stories as they pertain to automobile innovations, I think, so forth. John would know more about that. Some of you might know John Lambert. He was part of the committee that watched over. Skip Weaver had worked with Brad a lot on radio and about cars, and also had been a teacher here. And so small towns are communities, more so than the larger cities. And you find out pretty fast who talks the same language. And Dick Gassett, Jeff Albright, he worked with the Flying Yankee train restoration that Brad became involved in and wrote about every month. Loved doing those stories. Loved seeing the progress that experts and non-experts together were doing to restore this huge project of the train. Carl became instrumental in being part of the team that taught students here. And then you became the auto teacher, did you not? You became the auto teacher after Brad. And so it's, as I say, it's a community of like-minded folks. That's me. Do you have my phone? It's just a number. They're selling spam again. At Brad's house, I took a picture of his can of spam. I haven't posted it yet on Facebook, but the opportunity will come around, and maybe I'll just have it answer my phone. Look, here's spam for sure. And so Brad put up with a lot of my nonsense and was sometimes my best audience because he knew that he'd have to go eat alone if he weren't. But he would be amazed by the people in Newport who came for us, were digging in their pockets when all our newspapers were stolen, all our Newports were stolen, one month, and they didn't all get stolen. There were already newspapers at the small businesses and newspapers at the schools here. Fourth graders were using the Wicked Good as a literacy exercise. One of them was a pretty good reporter, loved reporting on athletics in fourth grade. And so the Wicked Good was part of a lot of people's homes and businesses, and when a bunch of them were stolen in bulk, Brad right away knew to go to the network, news people, get the word out. And then the community of Newport would call us, and some would come by and say, you got to get a gun and a big dog, and you got to get your office out of the living room window, Lucy. And we took some of that advice, but we never got a big dog. Brad got a little dog in Florida. Geezer was down there with a Geezer dog, and they were great companions. Charlie was his name. And we never got a gun, but I did move my office to an upstairs closet. That seemed to help cut down on the people, urinating outside my office window. I didn't have a window in that room. So it was an interesting time. Brad, I've got to tell you, Brad was called. We got a call one morning, and the person on the phone said, Brad there? I said, yes, he's right here. Handed the phone to Brad. That's when you had phones on cords. Remember those? Handed the phone to Brad, and they wanted him to come to this small engine repair place. Could he do that? Could he do it now? And Brad said, yes, because he's a Boston Street kid. Of course. Of course he would come. And he said, call Chief Hoyt if I'm not back in 15 minutes. And so he went up. It was a cold day, sort of. At least nobody was showing themselves outside the building. And he went in, and there were all these guys, hands in their pockets, standing around. They turned attention to him, looked a little scared. And Brad stayed by the door and said, I'm Brad Sears. Oh, yeah, we know that. And then they started fishing in their pockets, and he's backing up a little bit, he said. And before you knew it, they were pulling $5 bills, $10 bills, $20 bills out of their pockets, handing them to Brad. Make more newspapers. Make more newspapers. We might have believed that guy who stole your papers if he hadn't stolen your papers. But thank you. Thank you for doing that story. Thank you for putting up with that guy. And I think most of you know who the guy was. He was a town bully, still is. And he and his cronies and family were out grabbing armloads of papers everywhere. And our need was to keep the newspaper on the street. You keep the ink running. When you have a newspaper and people don't like what you wrote, you keep the ink running. You keep the newspaper machinery going. We didn't have the money for more editions. We didn't have the money to reprint another 1,500 newspapers for Newport again. But we did it twice because 80% of the costs of doing that came out of citizens' pockets, came out voluntarily. We got a few big checks in the mail, that was sweet, and those people could afford that, and they wanted us to keep the ink going. So Brad was loving that action. He was loving what we were doing. He was loving the controversy. And I have to tell you, Brad tried to warn me about himself. He said, I've got to tell you, Lucy, my politics are just to the right of Genghis Khan. And I said, well then, it's a good thing you're hooking up with a bleeding heart liberal, because only one of us could put up with you. Only one of us would be tolerant enough to deal with your crap. And that's the way we lived our lives together. We were opposites. We were people who somehow meshed together nicely. And when Brad and I would be at home working on the newspapers, and then we would say, okay, well, who's going to cook dinner? Well, I'm tired. Yeah, I'm tired. And so he would say, you know, I want to be waited on. So we would drive, and Brad would relax by driving. And so he didn't care if it meant driving 30 or 50 miles to go to a restaurant, one that we wanted to try. I would just be happy, you know, going out and getting a hamburger somewhere. But he knew what I needed was to get away from my office, because the computer will eat up your time. The computer will make faces at you. The computer will be very demanding. And he knew when I needed to get out. So I loved him for those things and many more. And I would remind him now and then that he'd been married twice. I was his last chance wife. And the name of his TV program before I knew him was Last Chance Garage. So I was his last chance living room, his last chance wife. And I'm very proud to be able to say that. And no, I did not move to Florida when he moved to Florida for his post-polio legs and his weak lungs, because I knew he'd want to stay there and not come back for the warmer months up here. And I had, 7,000 books online in my barn. They're heavy. So we spoke every day on the phone, and I would go down there every now and then. And no, he did not come up here in the warmer months, because in Florida, he started first one, then another, then 3 businesses that he had to stay down there for. He was rebuilding carburetors for the old car crowd, just like he did as a teenager in Needham at the Golf Garage. And he was doing a flourishing trade in evaluating cars that people wanted to sell or people wanted to buy, antique cars. And he was expert at crawling under those cars and taking pictures and evaluating whether the car was original parts or not. And people loved hearing that, because they went down there to play golf and buy a toy. They didn't go. They weren't down there to actually learn that stuff. But he was teaching them courses in their own garages too. He was teaching them to be wrench turners, to care about their cars, to understand the history of their car and why certain innovations were made and whether they worked or not. And so he was an encyclopedia of cars. My kids learned that every time we went for a ride with Brad, they'd test him. Okay, Brad, what's that third car up there on the highway, the green one? And of course, he knew. And he knew the whole story about that car. He didn't know the people who owned it. He didn't know its peculiarities except as when they were originally on the road. He took me to car shows and car and balloon shows, and so he tried that up here too. his gears were always, always turning. He was always learning. He was always reading. He got involved in the Granite State Gas and Steam Association in New Hampshire, and he learned a lot more about steam and the club of people who were keeping steam technology alive for their own interests, but for history. And he loved that group of codgers. He loved that group of incredibly knowledgeable, smart folks who were keeping a piece of history alive and teaching one another and gathering together in various yards. So he did that. And he got a tractor. It's still sitting in his yard in Florida. But he got a Ford tractor, an N something. I've forgotten what it's called. A Ford gray tractor with red on it. And when we had it up here, he gave these small children rides on his tractor. Then they grew. I don't think they would be sitting on his lap now, but when they were little, they all got rides on the tractors, on his tractor. And he would teach them about the machinery he had, the tools he had, and the other family members who would happen by as well. And he had radio shows out of Boston, and when we were up on a weekend before we moved up full time, he did his talk radio show in a side room of our house, and the ice began to break up in the river. Thunderclaps of ice breaking up. He had never experienced that. He described it for his Boston area radio listeners. He held the microphone up to the window. He described all of that. He brought New Hampshire to his Boston area listeners. When he learned that the Flying Yankee train was being restored nearby in Claremont, well, that was something. He had remembered, and he wrote about this in his first article, he had remembered as a small boy hanging out on that bridge as the train went under the bridge, the streamliner train went under the bridge, and people were so excited about that train. That was something new in the 1930s. Brad wasn't even 5 or 6 years old, I think, then. But that train was something. He would go summers to Canada, where his father's brothers and uncles would take him on their train every summer. Kid, how old was he? Do you remember his stories, Jeff? That old? Okay. Yeah. They would just put him on the train in the caboose, I think. And that was where he played. For however many weeks he was sent to Canada to get out of his parents' hair. And he developed a love for being on cabooses there. He developed a love for operating trains, for hearing the rhythm of the train. And so here was this deal in Claremont where there was a streamliner, and it was looking for a new life. It was looking to be restored. And so Brad wrote a story. The guy who owned the train, who'd just sold it to the state of New Hampshire for what, $1? And the story went out. All those papers went away that month, and the guy up in the White Mountains said, Brad Sears, you have to keep writing about this train. He was in marketing. You got to keep writing about this train. Every publication. Keep writing about the restoration. You need to write about this. You know the technology, and you write for people who are normal. and that was Brad's gift. Brad could write about technology and language that the rest of us, meaning me, some of you here are technicians, and he would write in ways that made sense. I was his editor. Brad was dyslexic and left on his own. Every long paragraph would be without punctuation. But it would be interesting if you took a breath where you knew there had to be punctuation. So I was his editor, and my challenge with an outstanding writer, a storyteller like Brad, my challenge was to keep Brad's voice in what he was writing. And that's important to remember if you know teachers or students who are struggling with language. It's important to keep the voice of the storyteller. And it's important not to belittle that voice, certainly. And in his day, there were a lot of belittlers. And he said he would not have stayed in junior high school had it not been for his janitor at the high school, who pulled aside kids, mostly boys like Brad, at a technical high school. You give them each a musical instrument, and they started a band. And those kids stayed in school. They stayed in school to learn things in addition to playing the instrument, or the trombone, or running to the band room to play together. They stayed in school because of a custodian who wanted them to stay in school. And he's told that story a number of times to people. And I knew what he was talking about. I have two brothers, both of whom were dyslexic, and the firstborn grew up belligerent and always insulted. No, he couldn't spell Czechoslovakia out of Time magazine up at the blackboard. No, he wasn't going to join the track team that the teacher was the coach of, just to pass that class. So he was the belligerent one. He managed to graduate high school wonderfully, and he went on to New Hampshire Tech. My younger brother, the fifth-born, charm. He had the charm. He could get away with anything. Couldn't spell, couldn't do sentence structure, couldn't take apart, put together machinery, but he had charm. And at 5, 6, 7 years old, he became on the path to successful education because his charm teased the teachers into letting him pass classes. He became a television journalist and then director of an association of boats that work the Gulf and go back and forth between those oil rigs out there. He became the director, the guy who went to D.C. to negotiate with the Coast Guard to have new classes in what needed to happen for those boat owners so that they could be successful. So my experiences with my brothers helped me to understand Brad and how it was he got through school in the many forms which he did. He told me his first job with radio he acquired when he was working parts and service at a dealer in Boston, and salesman from the radio came in and was trying to persuade. You probably have never had this experience, John, a salesman coming in to persuade you to advertise. Well, Brad came into the office at an opportune time. The salesman was reading what he wanted the ad to say. And Brad just started in on his practiced radio voice, did the ad from quick memory, did the ad, was hired then and there to be on radio voicing advertising. So in combining media work and writing and technology, and always working with cars, always finding that next job, and then on weekends working at his parents' garage still in Needham, Massachusetts. He was known there as the kid with the hands. And Boston Celtics players, many of them were living in Needham, at least during the season. They would come into the little garage in the center of Needham and say, "Is the kid with the hands here?" Brad never knew anybody's name among his customers. He knew them by what car they drove, the make and model of the car. And he worked a lot on cars that were routine and cars that were problem cars. And that was his job, to help out his parents, and his parents on a good week paid a minimum wage. And he helped them. He was a man with so many gifts. As Catherine was saying earlier, we didn't have Google then. We had Brad Sears when he was teaching here. So you have a question, a problem, a piece of history, you need to know. Google Brad Sears down the hall. Because I think, Catherine, if he didn't have the answer, he made it up very glibly, very convincingly. But he had a memory that never quit. He had an inquisitiveness about learning that never quit. He learned a lot about steam technology from these guys here in working on that incredible train. Somebody asked me about that train. I said, well, when it was purchased for New Hampshire, it was a static exhibit in Carver, Mass. Right, Jeff? And then people would say to me, well, where is it now? I want to see it. And I said, well, I think it's a static exhibit up at Hobel Railroad. The work stopped. The money ran out. The machinery and interest in marketing, the need to restore that train, kind of petered away. There has been a recent, short-lived, I think, resurgence among a group of people who thought, well, we should get that train restored. We should have it finished. Claremont got it to a certain level of completion. Claremont was doing a great job. Claremont was a business that needed to have their bills paid. And the state was not much interested in finding the money to pay those bills. Is that fair to say?
The state got grants from the federal government a couple of times. The real problem on raising money came from the board itself. They just didn't have
Yeah.
and they were set in their ways, and they just didn't know how to go and put their hand out and say, give me money.
And their marketing was narrowly defined, I observed.
Yeah, they wanted the train for up there and nowhere else.
Yeah. Whereas Jeff and others who had more vision about the opportunity with that train was to get that train to be Amtrak worthy, to go anywhere.
Well, I wasn't always a booster of that.
Ah.
They were the ones who wanted to do that.
Oh, the committee up north?
Yes, yes.
And yet they didn't have the vision to
Didn't have the vision to
follow
how to
through.
raise the money. And they really wouldn't take any advice from anybody. It was their way or the highway. And obviously, it went-
Brad and Jeff and I were contacted by people on this committee based in Concord or Manchester who had more recent thoughts about restoring that train. And so they came to find out what happened. And, or one guy came to find out what happened. And then you saw another guy too? I can't, or maybe someone called you.
No, I think another guy called Brad, but I never saw anybody else other than that guy at your house.
Yeah. So that dream was not captured, picked up, moved along, and still hasn't been. And it's a valuable piece of history that New Hampshire, that we in New Hampshire own. And so, anyway, Brad was excited that somebody was finally going to pick up the ball, and then they didn't. And meanwhile, down in Florida, he was finding that antique cars were becoming cars from the 1980s and 90s, and not the cars from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s even. And that was amusing. And he could still go to car shows and be the story guy about the history of these cars. And it was fulfilling for him to a certain level. And he was still following automotive news and innovations and the finances of the car industry. He was still on top of all that. It wasn't until Brad had first one stroke and then a couple years later another that his vision was impacted. And for the first time in his life, he was having carburetors returned to him as something wrong with this Brad. And people would still bring him carburetors because they wanted a Brad Sears carburetor. If he did it right, and it worked, he put his own stamp on it. He would do an impression that had his name, or at least initials, on that carburetor. That was his work. And so he was taking great pride in his work, as he should, because nobody else was doing that stuff. But in all these years, since he was that famous guy on TV, the Last Chance Garage guy, or the Brad's Garage radio guy for 30 years on the radio in Boston, he was still the media guy to certain people, and he appreciated that. And it was always amazing to me that when he ran into somebody who knew his work, who knew his history on television, on radio, they recognized his voice more than they recognized his name. Or one guy on the highway, I don't know, Maryland or Virginia or somewhere, Brad had too many flats on his trailer when he was taking his very long RV and his 20-foot long trailer loaded with stuff down to Florida. The last time he made the trip, he had already screwed up the reverse on the RV when he was maneuvering it in the yard. So he drove down to Florida with no reverse, a 30-foot RV, 20-foot full trailer, all loaded, and had flat tires on the trailer. He told me this story later. The third flat tire, he'd fixed the first two himself. hardly able to walk. He fixed the first 2 tires on the trailer himself. And the third one, he was calling around, he was trying to get help. I need a tire on a trailer fixed. Who can I call? Well, AAA wasn't interested, I guess. So he finally talked with someone who said, you see that place across the highway from you? You've told me where you are. Well, that place that looks like a gas and grab place, behind there is an auto shop, a service station. Here's his number. Brad called his number. And so the guy was talking with him, understanding what the problem was. And he said, what did you say your name was? And he said, Brad Sears. He said, okay, I'm looking at a certificate I have on the wall here that is signed by you. I took one of your classes. And he said, I'll be right over. And so the connection was made again. And he got his tires fixed. He got on the road. He pulled that RV onto his front lawn. He never moved it again. And finally he sold it. But it's always been amazing to me that his reach has been so extensive. And that was true here in Newport. Woman who came to see us at our house, she was so excited because it was the garage in Needham that Brad had just written about in The Wicked Good, his parents' garage, that she used to go to as a little girl in Needham to get a lollipop from Brad, because Brad was the one who gave out the lollipops. And she said, I was like this high. And those lollipops, I looked forward to them every time we went to get gas. And it was Brad who gave her the lollipop each time. And I'm going, Brad, what is this reach you have here? So, I finally stopped being amazed because it was just routine. The assistant music director in Foxborough Schools, he was at a party that Brad and I went to because it had been a special jazz night, special artist there. And I introduced Brad to this guy who happens to be a great trombone player, but also an assistant music director. And they started talking to each other, and my friend said, Brad Sears. No, doesn't ring a bell. But your voice sounds very familiar. And Brad said, well, where did you live in Boston? He said, I'm one of the Murphys. I was one of the youngest, and there were a lot of us, and we lived in such and such a location, Boston suburb. And he said, oh yeah, I know that family. And George said, I'm George Murphy. And I'm remembering now, you were the guy with the pickup truck who would come around with your kids and pick up a number of us kids and take us to the drive-in. You were Mr. Sears who took us to the drive-in. And Brad said, oh, I thought maybe you'd recognize my voice from the radio or from Last Chance Garage. George said, no, you were the drive-in movie guy. And I'm thinking, I can't go anywhere with this guy. He's got connections everywhere. Well, I've talked too much. Brad would tell you that. But he'd smile, I hope, when he did that. I know that Mr. Gassett has indicated he has a few things to say. And John Lunn has some episodes from Last Chance Garage, the original, that he wants us to watch, that we want to watch on the big screen in the classroom. We have learned that there are archives now that they are preserving of all those old How to Do It shows, and out of GBH in Boston. And so there are 2 episodes of those that we do want to get to. But I want each of you, if you have Brad Sears stories, you got to shut me up for a while, and please share your stories. Mr. Gassett, step forward, please.
Thanks. I'm Dick Gassett. Jeff Albright and I worked on the Flying Yankee train. John Lambert was very much supportive for us and let us use the station in many things.
Go up to the microphone, I think they're recording.
Many of the things that happened, one was very personal for me. Brad came in and checked on us on a regular basis. And one day he walked in and he says, "Hey Dick, this fella designed the Hawk missile for the Raytheon." And I said, "Wow." I said, "My father machined all those parts." And the fellow looked at me and says, "Your father was Red Gassett?" I says, "Yes, sir." And this is back in the 1960s. The fellow that Brad brought in was in his 90s, the engineer that designed the Hawk missile. And he said to me, he remembered my father's name, but he said, "The Raytheon got the Hawk missile because of your father." He says, "It took us 6 months." He says, "Your father figured out ways to machine things the way I designed them. They could not be machined." And then when they got the contract from the Department of Defense, he insisted my father be in the picture. And there's a picture that I have in our archives of the Secretary of Defense, the President of Raytheon, this engineer, I'm sorry I can't remember his name, and my father. And they put a white lab coat on my father, which was totally out of character for him. He was happiest with grease dripping off his elbows, you know. But that is still a bread and butter item today for the Raytheon, and he helped set up the 200-man machine shop. It took them 6 months after they built the first one, but it took them 6 months to set up the production line for that. Raytheon is still selling that item to the thing, but it was such a pleasure that connection, Brad bringing him in a story about my dad. So that was Brad. Thank you.
Thank you. Who else?
I'm John Lambert, and I've known Brad because this is his home, and I was chairman of the Automotive Advisory Committee, and Brad was a wealth of knowledge, and he instilled a lot of good technicians that made a living out of what they learned and made it interesting for those young people to learn the trade, as a lot of instructors had. But Brad had a special way, and he could fix anything. And and he was very organized. I mean, we still have the advisory committee bylaws that he had wrote for our committee when we first formed. And it's like the Constitution of the United States, you know, it was good and didn't have to change it, right? And he was very organized, a very, very good person with that. So really impressed with the expertise that he had. He was doing cutting edge things. I think eBay was selling cars, and he was going around and doing the inspection for people that are buying a very expensive car, and he'd have a bore scope, and he'd look inside the cylinders and do the normal stuff, and people would trust him because he had that much background and reputation. So we were very lucky to have him here. He was very comfortable here, and we really enjoyed his presence, and he'll definitely be missed. I'm sure he made a lot of impressions in the Newport students. I was going to say something about the Flying Yankee. Lucy, you had all those neat stories about him, but Brad and Jeff are the type of people that could make. They haven't made this Wilton engine in how many years? and they don't make parts for it, and they didn't make very many of them. So how do we reinvent remanufacturing this engine? And it was a big undertaking that Jeff had mixed feelings about because it was so expensive, but the Historical Society that was funding it wanted that engine back in the device. If it wasn't for that, it would probably be rolling right now with a conventional engine in it.
but bringing it back to the original design. And it's people like Jeff and Brad and these inventive people. They found people that could cast new pistons for it and make new parts and re-engineered the thing to make that engine work again. So we're lucky to have those people around, and you'll be missed.
I actually wrote something, which is funny because most people would think, gee, Skip, you talk enough without something written down. But anyway, I want to remind myself of some things about Brad. I met Brad at Arnell Auto Parts on Sunapee Street in Newport. And we got to talking, and we discovered that we had some commonalities. And he's talking with me, and he goes, I remember you. I'm like, what? He says, I worked at Erkin and Buick down in Stowe, Mass. And you were the warranty inspector who came in and looked at a car and told me that it wasn't the steering rack, it was actually a stiff U-joint in the steering column. I remember that. I said, you remember that? He says, yeah, because I was wrong. And that didn't happen very often. But anyway, we discovered we had commonalities. Lucy and Brad lived in Foxborough. I lived in Foxborough until I was 9. I believe you worked for the Foxborough Reporter.
I did.
And with Vin Igo. Vin Igo was a close family friend of mine. So we had all this commonality, and I got to talking to Brad, and he talked about his business, the ambulance doctor, and he talked about me going to work for him, and I thought about it, and I was like, nah, I don't think so. And so anyway, we'd bump into each other from time to time. And one day I bumped into him at Coronis Market. And he says, hey, he says, I'm looking for an automotive teacher over at Newport Middle High School. I said, I don't know. I don't have a degree. I said, I always wanted to do it because my mom was a teacher. And he said, well, you know, I think you'd fit. And I'm going, oh, gee, and he looks at me and he says very firmly, he says, apply. Okay, so I applied and I got the job. And I spent 2 years teaching here and really enjoyed it. And I have students who still contact me to this day. My point here is that if he hadn't seen something in me I hadn't seen in myself, I wouldn't have had the career that I've had since that point. Okay. I went on to teach down in Florida at UTI MMI. I went to teach at Seminole State College. It's the number one automotive program in the country. I also went on to work for General Motors AC Delco division. If he hadn't seen that in me, I might have never left Sunapee. So, thank you, Brad. You saw something in me I didn't know. So.
I'm Carl McKella. I was Brad's successor in the program here, and a little bit of what Skip said goes for me too. I came in here in 2001, and the first words that Brad Sears said to me that I recollect or said about me, I had a slightly longer beard at the time. We were right there in the classroom. I think Catherine Baird actually brought me down there. And he looked at me and he said, oh my God, another geezer. And I was coming in here as a paraeducator to help Brad. And that was in 2001 in the spring, in the middle of the school year. And so I stayed on as a paraeducator, and we got to talking, and Brad told me his intentions to retire. Of course, I was kind of surprised when I came in here that he was 67 years old and still teaching. And but you know, it was a thing with him. It wasn't so much the need of a job. He just enjoyed what he was doing. And so, you know, he's telling me his plans to retire in a couple of years and everything. And one thing led to another, and it was made available for me to get teaching credentials. And eventually, Brad retired, and I took over and taught the program. I was here until June of 2007 when I retired. But I learned an awful lot about teaching, the teaching skills from Brad. I learned some of the automotive skills. I've been in the automotive business in one way or another all of my life. The thing I learned, electricity, as any of you know, is an abstract. You cannot see it. The only time you see something that resembles it is a spark or lightning. And I had been in the automotive business all my life, and I knew enough about electricity to get by. Brad Sears brought me a long ways in electricity, and so it helped me very much for myself to understand it, and it helped me to teach it to the students in this program. And I certainly envy Brad's ability to write. I couldn't connect a few words and make a sentence out of them, but Brad definitely had that over me. When it came to automotive things, once in a while we'd have differences of opinion, and nothing Brad liked any better than to get into a discussion, an argument, debate, or whatever about it. And most of the time I lost, but it was always interesting. So he was a great man. We stayed in touch afterwards. In fact, I was not aware that he had 3 flat tires on what used to be my trail on the way to Florida. And but I visited Brad in Florida a few times, and he actually stopped at my place a couple times down there. And as I was telling Lucy, I hadn't communicated him for probably a couple years, but the last time communication I had with him was on the phone. But I certainly had great respect and enjoyed the amount of time that I had to spend with him. And that's my story.
Thank you.
He was the type of guy you could disagree without being disagreeable.
Oh, yeah.
Who else we got here? Jeffrey?
It's going to take me a minute to get up.
Can we move the microphone to you?
Oh, yeah.
John? Can we move the microphone over here to Jeff?
I'll make that. Yeah, and then Charlie had buddy Ralph next door, the little dog. Yeah.
Jeff Holbert.
His dog that lives at my house, he must have walked very well when trying to catch the game.
In keeping what Lucy said about Brad was always learning. He called me up one day at the railroad when I was working on the Flying Yankee. He said, "What are you doing from so-and-so to so-and-so?" And I said, "Working here, I guess, unless somebody says different." I said, "Do you know something I don't know?" He said, "No." He said, "I have this opportunity through the school to go to Nashville Auto Diesel Technical College." And he said, "You want to go? It's 2 weeks, it's free, and all we got to do is pony up the gas and rooms and our food." And I said, "Okay." So he and I drove down together in his father's, the Pontiac, yeah. And we, basically had a good time going down. While we were down there, we both took a course in air conditioning. And it was taught by an ex-Navy guy that was a Southerner that had done air conditioning his whole life. When the whole thing was over, we asked a lot of questions that, for some strange reason, nobody else in the class asked. And I could tell the guy was looking like that a few times. And when the whole thing was over, we were like the last two to leave the room. He said, I wanted you two to be last on purpose, because here, and he handed me one card, and it said air conditioning universal. So I had a universal license to work on up to 500-ton chillers if I wanted to, which is a very, very, very difficult thing to get. And Brad had a high-level automotive technician, senior technician license. I think Brad was a little miffed. Mine was higher than his, but
He didn't tell me that.
no, he would leave that out, I'm sure. And the guy that was teaching it, he was older than we were, and he was a little, bent over like I am now, and he looks up at us and he says, "Yeah, I didn't think there were any Yankees that knew anything about air conditioning." And I said, "Well, it's possible. Maybe we're the only two, though." And he said, "That could be." And while we were there, we took a couple other courses in engines and stuff. And, I was interested in the aspect of what they were teaching the kids, and I would ask them, "Well, what about this, and what about that, and what about this?" And one day, Brad and I stayed after class with 4 of the shop teachers, and we gave them a major grilling, as only Brad Sears could do. And
Did he set some traps?
oh yes, and they fell into them, and I sort of played the good cop, and I sort of rescued them a couple times, and by the time the thing was over, they were like this, standing there holding their books. They didn't know what to say. As the old saying goes, they didn't know whether to wind their watch or do something else. But the oldest one, I guess, who was the manager of that group, the engine group, he looked at me, he says, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a locomotive mechanic and electrician." He said, "Oh, that explains some of it." And he looked at Brad and he said, "And what do you do?" Well, when Brad got done explaining to him what he has done and what he did and everything, the guy was like, "Do you two want jobs?" And Brad looked at me and I looked at him, and I said, "Nah, I don't think so." I said, I don't like it down here. It's too hot. I don't want to leave New Hampshire, and I like the job I got now, even though I know it would cost you a whole lot more money to get me down here. So that's my continuing education story with Brad.
I really appreciate you all coming tonight, and I want you to be able to see these last chance garage shows that John Lund has arranged for. And this show, this night, this memorial gathering, John had told me was being fed live to probably some lions and tigers and bears. But there will be a recording. And NCTV is what you'll find on YouTube, John? No? Okay, thank you. Thank you. So I'm so very pleased that you all came tonight. I'm so very pleased that John is here to archive this for us. And I can't understand why Brad was only gone 12 years. How come we all look so older? but I was surprised when Brad followed me up here, and we were on a mission to live near the mountains or the water. So we're on the Sugar River on a dirt road. It's still a dirt road. It's an interesting place to be. And the train that used to run on the tracks between Concord and Claremont ran across the road from us. We still have cracks in the plaster in a few places. I'm told the last passenger train or baggage train or something went through in the 1970s. Am I right in remembering that? Thank you, John. And people are still finding railroad spikes along the trail. The state of New Hampshire takes excellent care of that trail. And since COVID set in, there's a lot less noise on the trail. There are a lot of bicyclists. There are a lot of people walking, more so than there have been in years. And that's a good thing. The state came up with some money and made Newport come up with more to maintain, to repair, to take care of the 2 railroad-covered bridges on that road. They are beautiful bridges. These kids were down there the other day, and at the Pier Bridge. No, not the Pier Bridge, the Laminated Arch Bridge, the Wright Bridge. So Newport has so much to offer to us still, to me.
You mentioned the covered bridges. There are only 7 railroad covered bridges left in the United States now. 2 of them are in Newport, 5 of them in New Hampshire, and 2 in Vermont. So they're
Yes.
all close by.
Yes, they are.
3 of them are on the old Claremont-Concord line.
Yes. One of the stories Brad wrote, he used to write our meandering pieces for the Wicked Good. And one of the stories, he had people on a round trip tour, and that tour came down Chandler's Mills Road to see the railroad covered bridges. And Brad was coming back from an errand, and he was outside of our house, and this van, New Hampshire plates, pulled up to ask him where the railroad bridge was, because they couldn't find it, they couldn't see it. And they were surprised when he went into the house more quickly than he could have later, in later years, but he went into the house and brought out the Wicked Good. And they said, "Oh, that's where we learned about these bridges."
Wasn't mud season though on that road back then.
If it had been, they'd still be mired there, I think. It would have dried up even more than when they came down from the senior center in Lebanon. Yes, a lot of folks still in Newport take those bridges for granted. And they are remarkable bridges. And don't let anyone forget that. And they are so tall because guess what? Those trains were wicked tall. And so durable because guess what? They had to be. Those were wicked heavy trains. And I am so glad that we came north from Massachusetts to Newport to be a part of the history that is that occasionally muddy road. You know, I still look in mud season for that hat, that straw hat that will be gliding across the road, down the center of the road, and you lift the hat up, and there's a geezer under the hat, and we say, "All right, sir?" "Oh yeah, got my horse under me." And I think that's a joke I heard when I was younger than these incredibly patient young people here, and it's still a good one. It's still a good one on mud season. So, eat up these snacks. Have some water. Peruse the literature that's up there. I brought a lot of Brad's writings. I brought 2 posters I had at home. There are a couple of samples of the book that he wrote as a companion to Last Chance Garage in the 1980s. And no, it doesn't talk about computers and cars. Do stay if you can to watch the shows. John spoke with me about which shows should I pick, you know, which ones do you remember, and I never watched them before, John. Not because I wouldn't have been interested, but because I didn't meet Brad till after he was famous. The 2 radio guys, Click and Clack, I've told this story before, but Click and Clack, Brad did not listen to them a whole lot. He had call-in radio shows about automobiles, and he mistrusted the information that they were handing out as jokes because the audience, Brad knew, were not as smart as a lot of folks who listened to those shows, and that he didn't want average consumers to listen to the joke answers for fix-its and get hurt. He did not want the average listeners to get hurt. On his radio shows, his show was 2 hours long. He took sometimes about 30 calls. And he would answer people. And if he didn't know the answer, he'd say so. The next week, he'd have the answer. And so he was, he had a lot of integrity with consumers. And I remember hearing him talk about Click and Clack and being concerned about the misunderstood humor. No, he did not.
I co-hosted a few times with him. I don't know if you remember that. But
Yes.
I remember off mic he'd say,
Yes.
"You know, if this was Click and Clack, they have the answers given to them by somebody else."
That's right. The calls would come in. The calls would come in. Brad knew because the producer of Click and Clack had moved to that show from Brad's Last Chance Garage show, and he knew that there were problems with the answers they were given because they had interviewed to host Last Chance Garage. It was Brad's concept, and he eventually was chosen as host for the garage because nobody else could do it, they said. And so they interviewed the Click and Clack boys for Last Chance Garage hosting, and Brad advised them that they'd do better on radio. And that's what they did. They developed a show on radio. And so Brad and I were South Boston. We'd gone out and had a wonderful dinner, and we were going back to the parking garage. And one of those boys, one of those old farts was, excuse me, kids, where did you hear that? One of those old guys was chatting with the guy taking the money, and we heard him say, "Oh, how did you recognize me? Was it my voice? Was it my voice?" And the guy taking the money said, "Well, yeah, that was part of it, yeah, but your name's on your credit card." And we were waiting, about COVID distance away, and then Brad said, "Oh, hi Ray." I think the guy's name